Notice something missing? Yeah, the audio. I didn't realize this until after I was done capturing game footage, but the game was in Roland MT32 mode, meaning all the sound effects and music were being played back over general MIDI, meaning that none of it was getting captured by DOSBox. Considering the fact that I was hearing birds chirping among other things, I didn't even think to check this until it was too late. However, this game actually has some pretty epic music, so I'm going to edit that in as appropriately as I can. As for the rest, there's actually not a lot of sound effects, so you won't be missing much. So, some of you may be wondering by this point why I haven't covered a huge number of RPGs or strategy games. Well, strategy games are obvious, because as I've said a number of times now, I suck at them. The reason I tend not to do RPGs is a little more subtle in that I do a weekly web show among other things, and RPGs demand an incredible time investment, especially today's ancient DOS game, Betrayal at Krondor. This is an absolutely massive game, at least as far as the story is concerned. You spend almost as much time playing the game as you do reading the story tidbits that come up, not to mention the time you'll spend organizing your inventory or participating in just a single battle. This game has a lot of stuff to do in it, and after about 5 hours of gameplay, I was only maybe 1/10 through the entire game. Even typical RPGs don't last this long or have this much story to go through. Of course, just because a game is big doesn't mean it's good, but aside from the story screens being surprisingly unresponsive, the rest of the game is actually pretty solid. Though the strategy element starts to get really tricky once you get past the first chapter, and thus I wasn't able to get much further because I kept getting slaughtered. Yeah, well, I've seen enough of the game to understand the principles of it, and I wouldn't want to spoil too much of the later parts of the game anyways, so let's get started. Betrayal at Krondor was created and released by Dynamics in 1993 and is a one-player 3D role-playing/strategy game. It primarily runs in a VGA 320x200 256 color graphics mode, but a handful of the story sequences, specifically the ones that open up and close out the various chapters of the game, run in 640x350 16 color mode. The game supports multiple devices for sound and music, and even has an impressive number of CD audio tracks, which you can enable or disable independently of your sound card selection. As for its current release date, the game's still commercial but readily available from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com, along with its pseudo-sequel, Betrayal at Antara, for $6. If you want a boxed copy for sake of collecting, they're pretty easy to find, but the prices are all over the place, so make sure you're getting a good deal, and also make sure you're getting the version you want, as this game had both a floppy disk and CD enhanced release, the latter of which is the one you get with the GOG package. The game was sold in just a jewel case as well, and that particular one's also easy to get a hold of and usually runs about $5 to $10. Betrayal at Krondor is actually based on the Riftwar Saga, which is a series of books written by Raymond E. Feist. In fact, Feist was credited as one of the co-writers of the story of this game, although he only really functioned as editor. Even so, he's since stated that he changed very little, as the story written by the game's developers rung very true to the world in which he created. It's also probably why this is one of the longest and most detailed story-driven RPGs of its time, since it's written kind of like a storybook instead of a game. This is particularly noticeable in how the characters you play as change from chapter to chapter, not to mention the fact that the game is indeed split into multiple chapters. It would take forever to describe exactly what's up with the story. Heck, the backstory in the manual, designed to help players understand just the basic gist of the Riftwar Saga, spans 8 pages. However, that's mostly because every little detail is elaborated on, so permit me to condense this down as simply as I can. The Riftwar Saga primarily takes place across 2 different planets, Midkemia and Kelowon. The Riftwar itself is a war that took place between certain races of both planets across magical rifts which link the 2 planets together. The story for Betrayal at Krondor specifically takes place 10 years after the events of Feist's book A Darkness at Sethnon, in which the Riftwar itself was actually ended. During those 10 years, there were a number of other events, but it leads up to a point where Senor Locklear, a member of the Palace Court in Krondor on Midkemia, is out in the northern lands investigating Moredhill activity. The Moredhill being a race of dark elves which aren't generally looked upon favorably at this point in the saga, since they've kind of united with the forces of evil on more than one occasion. However, after an altercation in which Locklear takes prisoner a Moredhill known as Gorath, and while Locklear is being bandaged up by a passing young magician known as Owen Bellaforte, Gorath suddenly springs to his feet and kills an assassin whom was not only about to make an attempt on Gorath's life, but whom was also one of Gorath's kinsmen. Troubled by this turn of events, Locklear drafts Owen into becoming his squire, lest his words and deeds reach their enemies, and the 3 begin their journey back to Krondor to inform the prince of events which are transpiring and the conflict which threatens to begin. Now, if you guys are thinking that's just the basic gist of the entire game, no, that's just the basic gist of the chapter. There's 9 of these chapters, each one advancing the story considerably. In fact, the story is so huge that the novelization of this entire game, released 5 years later, entitled Krondor the Betrayal, was originally 384 pages long. And yeah, they actually made the game into a book. The Riftwar Saga is one of the more popular fantasy series when it comes to the literary format, and considering how expansive and fleshed out this story is, I can understand why. When you first start the game, and after a bit of story stuff, you're dropped straight into the world with the dead assassin's corpse to loot. Now, most of the game takes place from this 3D perspective as you travel across the land, but one of the first things you're going to notice is the peculiar way the controls work. You see, the game doesn't actually have any real-time movement. Instead, you move and turn in steps. Now, this is going to feel very awkward at first, especially if you're coming into this from more advanced 3D games with real-time gameplay, but the non-real-time nature of the gameplay here does have its advantages. One of the biggest ones being that time doesn't pass until you move, meaning you can size up enemy forces from a distance or can plan where you want to go next without it getting dark out, since there is a day-to-night cycle going on, but it doesn't advance until you actually go somewhere. However, the only time you really use the keyboard is when you're moving around. Even though there's keyboard shortcuts for a lot of the actions you can perform, you're pretty much okay just using the mouse for everything, so long as you understand a few basics about how the interface works. Essentially, the left mouse button is used to select things and to activate things, the right mouse button is used to look at things or perform a secondary action if applicable, especially in combat, double-clicking will immediately activate things you normally have to select first, and clicking and dragging is used to move items around or to use one item on another. Speaking of the interface, by making the mouse controls slightly more complex than normal, things are very simplified in terms of what you see on the screen. For instance, the 3 party member icons in the bottom left have 2 functions. Left-clicking on one will open up their inventory, while right-clicking on one instead will open up their stats screen. Actually, speaking of the stats screen, there's quite a number of stats your characters can improve as they travel whenever they actually use those skills. But you can also help guide their advancements by clicking on which skills you'd like them to prioritize. Prioritized skills will improve faster than non-prioritized skills, but the catch is that the more skills you prioritize, the less of a difference there is in the amount of advancement, up to the point where if you prioritize everything, they all improve the same way as if you prioritized nothing. Another semi-useful feature is being able to see an overhead map of your immediate surroundings and a world map showing you where you are in relation to everything else. And I call this semi-useful because the world map isn't 100% accurate, and the overhead map doesn't really zoom out far enough to be of much help while out in the overworld. However, when you're in a dungeon or other underground place, it zooms out quite well, so I'm not really sure why they limited the overworld zoom as much as they did. No. As you move around the world, you'll also be clicking on the various things you come across, such as road markers, tombstones, houses, chests, and a variety of other objects that may provide exposition, or may have no real effect on your progress at all. You can also click on enemies to target them and plan an attack strategy, which basically boils down to getting the first turn when combat begins. Whereas if the enemy surprises you or isn't surprised by your advance, they'll get the first turn instead. Before I talk about the combat though, there's a number of other things to go into, one of the most important ones being your inventory. Now, one thing I was pleasantly surprised about with this game is that your inventory not only automatically organizes itself, but there's no weight limits. Instead, like the Diablo games, you have a space limit based on a number of slots. Each character has 20 slots to fit items into, arranged in a 5x4 grid, as well as slots for equipping weapons and armor. All you have to do to give them an item is to click and drag it from someone's inventory. If the item is a stack, such as rations or potions, you can also select how much of the stack to move, or even share the stack with all party members. Plus, if an item is universal to the party, such as money or keys, then it doesn't matter who you give the item to, it'll just go to the party. There's also quite a number of different locations to visit. When you look at your world map, all of the major locations are marked in white, while all of the minor locations are marked in brown. The difference being that when you visit major locations, you're simply provided with a screen of the location and have to click on various buildings and scenery to check it all out, while minor locations have the buildings rendered in the 3D world space, and you have to manually walk from building to building, clicking on the ones that you want to enter. There's also caves and mines to explore, but these places get really dark, so to explore them, you need a light source of some kind. Owen has some torches on him, but he can also use magic to create light, and both approaches actually result in different kinds of light, which is just another one of the neat little things that this game does to feel more engaging. Though, when you take a look at the magic system, you're probably going to be confused by why the game's telling you that casting spells is going to cost your health/stamina. Well, this leads into one of the game's more unusual choices for handling its stats. Every character has health points and stamina points. Combined, they equate to the total life energy of the character. Whenever a character casts a spell, takes damage, or performs a swing attack in combat, they lose stamina points, or if they're out of stamina points, they lose health points instead. The difference is that there's no consequences to running out of stamina points, whereas if a character's health starts to drop, so does their proficiency with all of their skills. Thus, a character who's half out of health points will also be half as effective doing whatever they're normally capable of doing. Suffice to say, when you restore health or stamina, the game always restores your health first, then your stamina. Other than all of that, you'll spend a surprisingly large amount of the game engaged in its story, which sometimes comes up when you least expect it, but you'll also spend a lot of time in combat due to the nature of this game's combat system. The combat system will probably feel very familiar to anyone who's played early video game adaptations of Dungeons & Dragons, or any strategy RPGs for that matter, since the combat system is essentially strategy-based. Your characters and your opponents occupy a grid-based battlefield, and on each of your character's turns, you can either move them, attack enemies that are in range, or perform a number of other actions, so let's talk about exactly what you can do here. Moving a character is relatively straightforward. Just click on the spot you want them to move to. If you highlight an enemy and they turn yellow, then they're in range for a thrust attack, which is the most basic and usually the most reliable form of attack. If you're already next to an enemy, you can right-click on them instead to perform a slash attack, which drains a little bit of your character's life force but does substantial damage if it connects. You can also click on your character's mugshot to access their inventory and use an item, but just the act of accessing their inventory will end their turn, so keep this in mind. From the icons in the corner, starting with the one in the top right, is the crossbow/magic button. Clicking this allows your character to shoot a quarrel at someone if they're equipped with a crossbow, or to cast magic if they're a magic user and are not directly next to an enemy target. Now, because of how damning magic can be, it's a good idea to keep at least one of your allies right next to any enemy spellcasters you face to prevent them from casting their magic in the first place. The next icon is the retreat button. When you click this, your party will attempt to retreat. The more opponents you're up against, the less likely this will work. It's also important to know that this command will never work if any of your party members have fallen. Basically, if you're up against impossible odds, it's much better to retreat early in the battle rather than later in the battle. In fact, the moment you win a battle, it's a good idea to save your game, either as a full save or using the game's bookmark feature, which basically acts as a quick save function. The reason being, battles are long and difficult, and thus it always sucks when you lose one. The next icon is the defend button. This ends the character's turn and puts them into a defensive stance until their next turn, during which they'll lose far fewer health or stamina points when they're attacked. A similar but very different button is the heart button, which also ends a character's turn but lets them regenerate a couple or more health or stamina points, the drawback being they'll be more open to attack until their next turn. And the scales icon in the bottom left is a bit interesting. After clicking on it, highlight an enemy and click on them, and your character will assess that enemy and give you some information about him. The stronger the character's assessment skill, the more information you'll get, though even with a low assessment skill, you'll typically get at least one piece of information. The last icon in the bottom right is the auto combat button. Basically, if you think you're going to win the battle no matter what, you can click this button and the game will automatically fight the battle for you. Now, typically, the game won't use any magic or anything fancy while doing this, so if your advantage against your opponents relies on magic, then it's a good idea to just stick with manual combat. Or if you do engage the auto combat feature, then change your mind, just click the button again to cancel it out. Unfortunately, as I said, I suck at strategy games, so many of the combat situations near the end of the first chapter and early in the second were extremely difficult for me, and eventually I was just unable to really get any further. However, I did learn early on that Owen's blinding spell is extremely useful, since blinded enemies tend not to move or attack, so make darn sure you put that spell to use. Also, occasionally you'll venture into traps, which use the combat engine. And they're essentially puzzles which require you to push things around and such in order to escape. The grid feature you can toggle by pressing the G key during combat is extremely helpful in safely getting through these things, but I highly recommend when you find one to run from combat and save first, because making mistakes in these traps can be deadly. While the graphics engine and method of control in the 3D environment is highly dated, this game really isn't about the gameplay, even though it's actually really well done. It's about the story. Playing through this is very much like reading a book and playing a game at the same time, and you will have a massive amount of text to read through to truly understand what's going on. This is an RPG through and through, with a turn-based strategy system for combat and plenty of story to go along with it. If that sounds even remotely interesting to you, then this game is definitely worth your time to check out. However, you really do need to be interested in all three of those aspects to really get into this game, since all three of them are important. Failing that, you may just want to read the novelization instead, which actually only runs about $7 to $9 both in paperback and e-reader form. As for configuring the game in DOSBox, just set cycles to max and you're good to go. Curiously, the GOG release also sets the CPU type and mem size values differently, which I find kind of confusing since the settings they use don't seem to have any effect on the game. If you want to apply those extra steps with a physical copy of the game, just set mem size to 8 and CPU type to 386_slow. Also, if you're running the actual CD version of the game, you're definitely going to want to create a QBin image file pair and image mount them in DOSBox, considering the massive number of CD tracks this game accesses. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Kinda hard to believe I've already covered 3 games this month. The next episode isn't until April 6th, so there is a bit of a wait. In the interim, I've got a bit of work to do fixing a visual mistake that's popped up in every Season 3 episode so far, plus I finally have the ability to start uploading my music in MP3 format, so expect to see some of that next weekend or maybe the weekend after. As for the hint for the next episode of Ancient DOS Games, well, there's an edutainment title I almost covered last year, but it didn't quite make the cut. Now, some of you might already know what game it is, and some of you may have to go re-watch those episodes, but in any case, if you think you know which game it is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in on Saturday, April 6th as I contribute at least one game to Edutainment Month.